Welcome. You are watching UnHerd. This is LockdownTV, day 2 of the official government lockdown, and we are all stuck in our houses watching the lovely spring day outside and unable to leave. So the plan is we are going to make use of our amazing network of big brains who we're lucky enough to have contributing to UnHerd and get their take on how to survive it and what big ideas might or might not come out after it. So question number 1 for us today, and I'm happy to say we are going to be joined to discuss this by Mary Harrington. If we can see Mary yet, I do not know, and Sam Leith. There they are. They have just magically appeared on the screen, hopefully. Mary is a columnist for UnHerd and a great favorite of ours. And Sam still doesn't seem to be there. Oh, he's now arrived. Can you both see
I'm
me?
visible, I think, but I can't hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay, great. Well, I'll try and make out what you're saying and respond appropriately.
Okay, well, so let's start with Mary in that case. I mean, the question is, how do we get through this? You wrote a piece for us on UnHerd this morning, giving your kind of tips on how to survive it, basically. You gave 10 pointers. How is your lockdown so far, and what are those tips?
To be honest, for me, it's not massively different from my normal life, which is kind of why I wrote the piece I wrote. I stopped working in an office some years ago when I got pregnant. And then I spent a couple of years basically being a stay-at-home mum, and that was nice enough. And after a while, and then I sort of accidentally found myself working from home mostly for UnHerd. So I've sort of gone seamlessly from having a commuter-type job to not having a job, well, having a mum job, to working from home. And to be honest, the lockdown doesn't really affect me, which is. Well,
which is why you're an expert ahead of everyone else, basically,
right,
because you've been doing it for a while.
The aim is not to try and sound smug, because I think a lot of people are finding this extremely tough, and certainly that we're in a strange, unsettling, disturbing situation. But one thing I can say, and that's firstly that adjusting to having your work and your family and your relationship all under the same roof is not as straightforward and idyllic as you might imagine. And secondly, there are ways through it. You know, there are habits that help, and there are things that definitely don't help. And so if I wanted to write something, it wasn't to say, oh, look how nice my life is. It was to say, you know, here are some things that I learned, and here are some traps I'll suggest that you don't fall into, because I did.
So what's the number 1 then that you suggest?
Get dressed, have a routine. It sounds so mundane, but I think, you know, lots of people joke about how they go completely feral when they're working from home, and, you know, they don't get up until noon, or they sit up all night watching TV, or wander around in your pajamas. You know, getting up and having a shower and getting dressed is the number 1 first thing. That, you know, there are various sort of new mum gurus, people like Gina Ford, and there's a housekeeping person on the internet called Fly Lady, who write these sort of lifestyle tips for people who've fallen off the end of the sort of work life, the office life schedule, where you really have external forces shaping your life. And the rule number 1 is get dressed. You know, and it sounds so mundane, but when you don't have to, a lot of people who are just not used to having no external pressures and no expectation that anybody outside is going to look at them all day. You know, lots of people just won't bother to get dressed. Once you fall into that, it's a short step from that to letting your body clock go haywire and feeling chronically jet lagged, and from there, it's a short step to really struggling with your mental health.
So you actually you end your top 10 tips with bread baking, which I was quite impressed with. This is a very kind of wholesome, embodied version of kind of staying at home. It occurred to me that Sam, who we're going to hear from in a second, has had quite a different strategy, which was to disappear into the world of Warcraft. If Sam's there, can we hear a little bit about your lockdown? Oh no, Sam. Okay, we're gonna, in that case, let's go back to Mary. So the question is, you know, are there kind of 2 divergent strategies here? Either you sort of like use this period where you're closed in to kind of, you know, live in your body and, you know, enjoy those routines and bake the bread and go for the you know, kind of realized life experience, or should we kind of look for things to totally escape with?
To be completely honest, Freddie, I don't think they're as, certainly for me, they're not polarized like that. In as much as, the other thing I did to stay sane when I was a stay-at-home mum was be absolutely obsessed with politics on Twitter. So the two kind of go together for me. I mean, I have these sort of embodied things that I do in the actual world to keep myself sane, which includes cleaning the house every day and baking bread and going for runs and things like that. But I'm also glued to social media, and I would desperately miss my internet life if it got taken away from me. So I don't really see the two of them as separate. It's more, if I've emphasised the embodied, it's because I'm kind of assuming that if you're reading this article, chances are you spend a certain amount of your time on the internet, and are plugged into social media and all of those things.
So how long do you reckon you could survive with this kind of lockdown? It sounds like you're coping quite well. I mean, do you think this could be a long-term existence?
If they take my running away, I will struggle after a few weeks. If they don't take my running away, probably pretty much indefinitely.
So do you have, we're going to talk to Will Tanner and James Kirkup in a second. I mean, do you have any kind of hopes, looking more broadly and politically, about this experience and what it's going to lead to?
I think it's too early to make any big pronouncements, and I think there'll be it's going to be a very mixed bag what comes out of this. But if there's one positive thing that I would really like to see come out of it, and I really have hope that will come out of it, it will be more place-bound, specific local connections. Just to give you an example, we set up a little WhatsApp chat for our street that I think more than half of our street is now connected to. And I just discovered that the lady 4 doors down has chickens, and we're in quarantine at the moment because enough of us have slightly worrying symptoms that we just don't want to be spreaders. And B, who lives 4 doors down, just dropped off half a dozen eggs from her chickens, and I PayPal'd her £1.50, and I just think there's no way that could have happened 10 days ago, and that's kind of amazing.
So you're in a village, aren't you, Mary? Is that right?
Sorry?
You're in a village, is that right?
It's a small town. It's about somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, so not tiny. But
so I guess it might be quite a different experience in a city or in a block of flats.
Yeah, I imagine so. I mean, I honestly do not envy people who don't have gardens right now, and I do not envy people who have difficult marriages right now, and I do not envy people who don't have a partner, who have children and are single parents. There are lots of situations where where the lockdown is making life phenomenally difficult, and I just take my hat off to every one of those people who's trying to make it work.
So do you think we need to be careful before, talking about potential upsides to this? Talking about things like place and rediscovering local communities. I mean, it's something we write about a lot. We talk about a lot. Maybe that might be one outcome of this, but some people might just get to know their community and hate it. This might be the first time they've spent time with people where they haven't been commuting or whatever, and suddenly they see what their neighbors are really like, and they think, thank God I never hang out with those people.
Well, I think lots of us kind of think that about our families even on a regular basis, but it's more, I don't know, I think if the bonds you have with people who are near you and are sort of a function of necessity rather than something that you necessarily chose for yourself, they have a slightly different quality to them. It's more of it's less of a, I choose to spend the rest of my life with you feeling as though you're in my life now, whether I like it or not. So we're going to make it work one way or another. And I think there's room for more of that in everybody's lives, but it's also true, as you say, that can be a difficult thing for some people, or it can be an imprisoning thing for some people. And it's not a straightforward.
To kind of map that same question on the whole of society, the question is what comes when we come out of this. Will there be a kind of revenge of individualism, revenge of wanting to get up and get out because people have been kind of held back for so long? I mean, that's the counter argument, isn't it?
I don't know. To be honest, I don't know. I think certainly, if and when this
Sorry?
comes to an end, there's going to be an almighty party.
Yeah, why don't we do that?
I mean, you know, in as much as there are volunteer
I'm
community,
with you now, yeah?
you know, I think, you know, the one thing I would be nervous about would be seeing any sort of political initiative to turn them into an alternative to state provision, where actually state provision would be appropriate, for example. I mean, I'm conscious, for example, that a lot of people accuse David Cameron's Big Society initiative of becoming effective, you know, becoming a stalking horse for government cuts. And I think if people start saying, well, you know, actually we coped during the coronavirus crisis with all of these NHS volunteers, why don't we just staff the NHS with volunteers? Then that's not really going to benefit anybody in the long term, because all that's going to happen is even thinner resources.
Have we got Sam back? Do I see Sam?
We have.
Amazing. Should we go and see if we can go to him? Sam, hello. We see you and we hear you. We were just we were talking about the impact of this lockdown period. I just want to rewind a bit and just hear about what you wrote for us on UnHerd, which is that you have, or either are planning to, or already have, used this as an opportunity to disappear into the world of Warcraft.
Partly because I've got 3 children. Oh, fuck.
Sam, do we still have Mary? We briefly had Sam Leith. This is live. This is our new technology, and so far we're quite pleased with how it's going. But people are coming in and out. This has probably been everyone's experience doing meetings today. Let's give him one last go. Sam, you were there, and then you weren't there
again.
Let's see if we can go to Sam.
So you're asking me about World of Warcraft and the temptation to go back into that world.
Yeah, it just struck me that it was a kind of slightly opposite strategy to some of the things that Mary had been talking about in her article, and it feels like that is the choice when you're sort of incarcerated, whether you're supposed to sort of enjoy.
Or do you retreat inwards and away, or do you kind of find ways of reaching out to the world?
Exactly.
I mean, I was only being semi-frivolous about World of Warcraft being a kind of way of escaping. I mean, in some ways it is, because it's a very much more agreeable world than this one, populated though it may be by, you know, fearsome giants and noisome Molochs and so forth. But it's also, funnily enough, there is a connection in that world. I mean, it's an escapism in the same way you might escape into a computer game, but it's also a way you can meet friends in a sort of virtual space who are on quite the other side of the world. I mean, I found I was spending more time with a friend who lived in, you know, La France Profonde, and a couple of friends who lived in California, day after day after day, than I was with most of my real friends when I was in Warcraft, because you'd kind of go into WoW and you'd seek each other out and you'd go and, you know, bash monsters together. But there is a sort of sociability to it as well, weirdly, even though, you know, to look at it, it's a sort of sub-Tolkienian fantasy world full of, you know, dragons and all that sort of nonsense.
So do you hope that sort of parallel social world might be rekindled during this period then?
Well, I think it's one of many parallel social worlds and virtual social worlds which we're essentially discovering and making use of in this situation. I mean, it strikes me, whether or not you're playing a video game or, you know, connecting through Zoom or through any of these apps, which are presumably the only stocks currently rising in the market right now. I mean, it strikes me that had this situation obtained, say, 30 years ago, you know, before the age of mass media and mass communication and all these digital means of connecting in digital space, we would have found it much, much, much harder. I mean, getting news, making connections, you know, we would have been literally kind of locked up with nothing but the contents of our libraries, which might have suited some of us, like me, quite well. But the more sociable among us would have found it much, much harder. I mean, I think, you know, thank goodness this is happening in the internet-enabled world.
I mean, it also is there an argument for saying that that same access to information makes the whole thing more stressful? I mean, we're now sort of, glued to this daily rhythm of the 5 p.m. press conference, and the kind of BBC News alert comes, and it's like, crikey, how many people have died now? Maybe it'd be better to hear less.
That's certainly a decent point. I think that, of course, social media and the kind of constant news cycle feeds our catastrophizing instincts. And, I think practicing good kind of mental hygiene involves, knowing when to step back. Sorry, just being into... knowing when to step back and knowing kind of how to treat the enormous flow of information and of kind of some of it good, some of it bad, some of it hair-raising. But, getting out as far and as fast as they have, the message that you have to stay home, the speed with which the really important information is propagated, virally, you could say, is actually probably a positive trade-off.
Is it going...
you need to be a bit scared.
Before we move on to the next question, is it going all right for you, Sam? I mean, is it going all right for you, this lockdown? Do you think...
Yes. Well,
how long could you survive it?
I haven't left the house in about 4 days.
Right.
And, well, I've got these 3 children under 11. So what's been slightly galling is that various of my friends have said, oh, I'll bet you're brilliant at homeschooling. They must be having this wonderful kind of experience of you bringing all the fruits of your knowledge to them in a kind of witty and like encouraging way. And I'm like, on the one hand, I'm very flattered that this is the presumption my friends are making. On the other, I'm deeply depressed by the vast gulf between that presumption and the reality. I'm spending most of the time just sort of shouting at them, stop trying to bounce a football when we're supposed to be teaching them maths. So it's a pretty fraught time.
Well, good luck in managing the rest of it. Mary also, I don't know if we still got Mary there. Any concluding thoughts from you, Mary? You heard what Sam had to say there.
I think it's early days, to be honest. Lots of us. I certainly think there's a possibility that parents who are used to being very hands-on with their children in the limited time they have available with them are going to become a lot more like the kind of incredibly horizontal, laissez-faire stay-at-home mums who see their children all the time and therefore don't really care if they're just bouncing up and down on the beds. This is not directed at you, by the way, Sam. doing what they need to do to survive. Certainly, I'm used to being quite strict about television, and that is just not occurring at the moment. Not least because everybody's feeling slightly under the weather, but I've just completely zero guilt about turning the TV on when it's absolutely necessary. I think a lot of people's normal when it comes to parenting, when it comes to all sorts of structures of ordinary life, are about to be shaken up massively, and some of that will be good, and some of that will probably be less good. It's really too early to tell.
Thank you. Thanks, Mary. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for sharing those thoughts.
Thank you.
Sorry about the tech troubles.
So it was a pleasure.
Right. So our next guests are Will Tanner of the UnHerd think tank and James Kirkup of the Social Market Foundation. Both of them think tank bigwigs. Do we have James? He is not appearing so far. So far I can see Will. No James yet. Let's start with you then, Will.
Okay.
So how can we map the sort of stuff we've just been hearing about from Mary and Sam, the small world experience of people suddenly having to get on with their own families, with their own neighbors, on the kind of bigger political situation? What impacts do you foresee on society and politics when this finally is over?
Well, I think you're already starting to see some quite profound changes in the way in which people go about their lives. And that's not just coming from the kind of massive changes that the government has introduced, the restrictions that are in place in terms of our ability to move around, our ability to go to certain types of shops, or indeed our ability to kind of maintain business continuity. We're already seeing some of the political debate shifting quite considerably. I mean, it's extraordinary that we saw a very new Conservative Chancellor move from introducing probably one of the most radical Conservative budgets in recent times to underwriting the entirety of the UK economy and guaranteeing the jobs of 10% of the workforce within 10 days. So we're already.
Were you happy about those things?
Well, I think the government has acted with welcome alacrity and flexibility, and has clearly tried to move heaven and earth to give as much confidence as possible to business and the wider economy. I think that was definitely the right thing to do. It's also clear that they're working at pace to ensure the NHS has the equipment and the resources it needs to respond to the crisis.
But Will, more I'm thinking more sort of philosophically, I guess. You know, they're the sort of immediate responses to the crisis aspect. But you know, there's been a lot of talk of the kind of liberalism, hyper individualism, and all of those things being sort of ultimately challenged by this, because it not only is it a disease that requires a communal response and kind of just looking after yourself won't work, but also, you know, you need a state, or you need a community, or you need more than just a kind of free market to deal with a crisis like this. So there have been muted signs, muted comments that some people are actually quite pleased with what changes might come out of this, or at least, you know, they feel like their worldview has been proven right in some way. Do you have any of those feelings?
I mean, I think it demonstrates that the government understands that the state has an important role, and that it's not ideological about a kind of de minimis state. I guess the question I have, and the gap I think in the government's armour at the moment, is around what you might call the social stimulus to sit alongside the economic and public health guarantees that they've given. We've had a lot of money for the economy, some guarantees for business. We've had support for the NHS, but we haven't had very much, even rhetoric, let alone action, to support the thousands of small organisations, the community groups, the mutual aid networks that are frankly going to be more important now than they've been in a long time, and possibly more important than some of the institutional responses.
But wouldn't if government gets too involved in them, won't it ruin them? I mean, isn't the whole idea of local organisations that they're not involved in the government?
So to some degree, but I think there are lots of things government could do to make lives easier for those type of organisations. So, for example, it currently takes 40 days to register a charity in order to benefit from gift aid and some of the other tax exemptions that apply for charitable donations. It takes 4 weeks to get an enhanced DBS check that volunteers need to do kind of basic support for vulnerable people in receipt of healthcare. There are numerous restrictions on the ability of people to kind of care for the children of key workers, for example. There are lots of things government could do to kind of get out the way and unleash the power of civic society. And just in the last few hours, we've heard that 170,000 people have responded to the government's call for volunteers to support the NHS. That's just an amazing example of people in the space of just a few hours responding to the call to support and demonstrating their willingness to help.
Okay, so it's more of stepping out the way and removing barriers to these kind of mutual aid and sorts of things happening than actually government involvement in them that you envisage.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
James, let's go. I think we have James back. He's been coming and going as well. Sometimes we're not sure whether he's remaining incredibly still or whether he is actually frozen. But James, can you hear us? That'll be a no. If he comes back, we will talk to him. So I'm gonna play James's part for him a bit in this one, because he wrote a great piece for us this morning on UnHerd, where he said that, you know, libertarianism is kind of destroyed by an event like this, and that during a crisis such as this, the whole kind of free market ultra view just doesn't even seem relevant. You know, we saw Steve Baker in the House of Commons, you know, really committed free marketeer. I don't think you'll find anyone less keen on sort of government interference than him, giving this kind of weepy speech about how sad it was, but there was no element of disagreeing with it. Even he is signed up to this government intervention. Do you agree with James that sort of this is one on the nose for the libertarians?
Well, I think it does challenge much of the worldview of people who believe that the state just needs to completely get out of the way, and that there's no role for government as a kind of guarantor of people's security and freedoms. And I do think it's been fascinating to see some of those people who've been most kind of aggressively supportive of libertarian policies in recent years step back and often actually be some of the fiercest advocates for government intervention. There is a kind of soft authoritarianism to some libertarian thought, especially in places like Twitter. So I do agree. I wasn't reading his article this morning. I wasn't entirely convinced by the thesis that that people going to pubs and parks on the weekend was an example of people not knowing what's good for them, and therefore not being kind of treated with respect to their own kind of judgments. Just because, to some degree, I think people's behaviour at the weekend was loss aversion rather than availability bias. I think it was people knowing that lockdown was coming and trying to get as much freedom
or just taking the view that they had judged the risks differently and decided to do whatever they fancied doing. Do you think I just want to put another kind of counter view here? There was that David Aronovich piece, I think it was last week, in the Times. He seems to really kind of have a thing about the post-liberals, as he calls them, and is convinced that they are a dangerous group that are somehow going to unravel the decades of liberal advance. I actually thought he sounded quite persuasive in a sense, because he said that when this is over and when the kind of all of these forbiddings and depressions have been released, there's going to be a huge sort of comeback, and that in a sense, by having our liberty denied us in this way, all that's happening is we are reminded how much we love it, and we want a more liberal, we want a freer and more unchained society afterwards. What do you reckon?
Well, so I agree, it's a kind of convincing theory. I'm just not convinced I see any evidence of that in practice. I mean, my overriding reflection on the last few weeks has been a sense that people are coming together more than they were before. They are overwhelmingly supportive of some of the restrictions that Boris Johnson has introduced so far. All of the polling evidence is very clear that there's strong public support for those restrictions, and some of the backlash against people like, for example, Mike Ashley and Sports Direct trying to kind of profit or kind of take advantage of some of those restrictions and kind of use those freedoms that many people value, I think demonstrates the opposite of what David is arguing. I mean, people, as you say, are kind of coming in with a more communal support for kind of mutual betterment and mutual aid rather than individual liberty. So I think it perhaps works in theory, but the proof is in the pudding. And at the moment, I don't see very much evidence that that's actually happening on the ground. And
then before I let you go, let's scale out one more step, as it were, to nations, because we talked about what happens at like a local level versus a national level. The same kind of discussion is going on about nations versus the global community, isn't it? Because clearly what we've seen is the moment a serious crisis hit, as it just has, every nation has retrenched back to the national level, and all the big decisions have been taken there. And the European Union has not really covered itself in glory in terms of any collective steps to help its member states. And so in a sense, this is a kind of like proof that the nation state is the level where people want to make decisions when it comes to the crunch. But the counter argument is, which we hear a lot, is that, disease knows no boundaries, respects no frontiers, and that long term, the idea of tackling problems like this at a national level is for the birds, because unless we all get rid of something like a virus, it's going to come back and haunt us anyway. Where do you stand on that one? Do you think this is a kind of moment of nationalism and should be seen as that, or is this a time for kind of global cooperation?
So I think that's the big question as to what happens next, whether the response is international or national. My own personal view is that I think this will be a return to some kind of national focus rather than a kind of global response. It's been clear that the global structures have not been adequate to the task at hand over the last few weeks, and whether it's actually, I would argue, the WHO or the EU, lots of the international structures haven't delivered some of the kind of reassurance and coordination that they needed. So it really is nations that are responding to this. I would just question whether or not those two things are entirely in contradiction to one another, though. Ultimately, international organizations take their legitimacy from national governments kind of ceding some level of sovereignty and accountability to that international body. And just like the UN, just like all of the post-war institutions, I suspect we're going to need some kind of League of Nations coming together to
a league. We'll go back to 1925.
Sorry.
We'll go back to a League of Nations. You think we can?
Well, perhaps not called a kind of capital L League of Nations,
right?
But some kind of group of international organizations, of national organizations coming together on the international stage to broker what the international regime needs to look like to prevent this from happening again.
But there's talk of some. There might be new treaties that exactly. There might be some sort of protocols you sign up for to avoid kind of risks to humanity, where you need to take care of hygiene and disease control and stuff in your own country. So
exactly. And in the past few years, I mean, it's clear that some of the controls on some of these things in places like China have not been strong enough to safeguard the rest of the world. So there are kind of good reasons to introduce new systems for these type of activities.
Which makes me give you one final question. I can't resist it. Do you want to see reparations paid by China to the rest of the world?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that's likely, and I don't think it's necessarily desirable either.
Okay, thanks, Will.
Thanks, Freddie.
Sorry we didn't get James Kirkup. He had a bit of internet trouble. So thanks for that. We are now in very few moments going to talk to Andrew Watts, who has written a great piece for us this morning on UnHerd. We started today's Lockdown TV session with the miniature world of the domestic. We talked about families and how you cope in the environment. We zoomed out and we've talked about society and states and whether there's going to be big changes to politics. And now, in whatever the opposite of ending on a cheery note, we are now going to talk about funerals.
But I think we do need to talk about them. And that's the thing I've noticed and why I wrote the article, is that people are talking a lot about the lack of supplies for protective equipment in hospitals and social care, and rightly so. But there are shortages for funeral directors as well, and they need to be protected, and they are worried. One of the things that came up is that they have not been given government advice, and the Cabinet Office weren't talking to them until last week. And it was only at the last minute that it was decided that funeral directors are key workers.
So just to backtrack, to put us in the picture, Andrew, so you've actually been talking to funeral directors. You've spent the last week or two talking to funeral directors and people who are involved hands-on in the, as you call it, death management business.
Yes, that's what the government calls it.
Right.
Not the euphemism I would have chosen, but yeah.
So you've been really doing some hands-on research here.
Well, I wrote an article back in January. It was just after the 6th of January, which is traditionally the day of the year with the highest death rate, because it's the last day of Christmas and because it's the middle of the winter flu season. And after that, everyone was saying, now there's nothing going to be happening for the next year or so. And that's all been turned around in the last month or so.
So you mentioned in the piece this morning what's going on in Italy. What do you know about how this much under-discussed part of the world is coping in Italy.
Well, and the most horrifying thing was the films, I don't know whether you saw it, of the army taking dead bodies in army trucks because the local death management industry couldn't cope. That was a particular issue in Italy because there aren't that many crematoria, and most people, being Catholic, want to be buried in the traditional fashion.
But not here, you said. So we don't get buried in the UK very much. Is that right? Most people opt for...
Yes, it's 77, 78% of people get cremated, and the rest are mostly buried. Tiny proportion buried at sea, but it's pretty much all cremation now.
So you were mentioning that there might actually be a kind of impact in the long term of how we think about funerals. I mean, it's not something that we like to talk about, but UnHerd likes to go to those places that other people don't want to talk about. There are these two parts to a funeral as you go through, which is, there's the ceremony where you remember someone, and then there's actually the body. You suggest that these might actually separate entirely?
Well, when I was talking to people in January, they were saying that conceptually, for most people, these are two different things. I don't necessarily agree with that. And people were talking about how these are getting separated more and more, and saying whether this was a good thing or a bad thing. Some people think it's a great thing because, they don't want to get involved with the body. They're quite happy to have the ashes there. That's nice and safe, but they don't want to get involved with the actual business of looking at someone who's died.
Do you find, Andrew, when you're talking about this, I mean, I certainly do, that it's so rarely spoken of, and it feels sort of transgressive in some way to even go there. I'll be watching our viewer figures and see if people log off at this point, but even during a crisis like this, when obviously mortality is something people think about more, it doesn't get spoken of, does it? I mean, do you think we should be talking more about it, or do you think it's just the way it is, and there's something kind of fundamental about this topic that people want to steer clear of?
Yeah, in general, we should, and for no other reason than that your family know what you want when you die, which is a huge problem in general terms. At the moment, people aren't talking about it because it's really uncomfortable. I mean, I've had a look at some of the plans, and they are there. They're hard to find, but
this is the plans if, in the unhappy event that we have a surge in the number of people dying.
Yes, and it is all well sorted out, but
so these are temporary morgues and those kinds of things.
Temporary morgues. And I heard today about a football club which is prepared to receive refrigerated lorries if things really do go badly. And I was told I wasn't allowed to say where it was because that is absolutely top secret. Wow.
Well, Andrew, thanks for talking to us about this.
Think about the worst case scenario, I think.
Yeah, I hope that those measures won't be needed, obviously, but I suppose in a bleak way, it is reassuring that they are at least in place. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in today. This has been day number 2 of our Lockdown TV. This is the new effort here at UnHerd to gather together the brains that we have writing for us and in our editorial team to try and see if we can chew the cud every day, weekday at 4 p.m. to see what the wider implications are and what this crazy time is going to do to our wider world. Hope you enjoyed it, even though it had somewhat of a bleak ending, and see you next time.